trust is a deliberate outcome of specific actions and practices. There's truly no margin for error, so that if something goes wrong, it goes wrong everywhere globally. Pay your customers, break it before your users do, open the black box. Hello and welcome back to Lead with IT. Today I'd like to talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I call it trust by design, or ways that we can design trustworthy innovation with intention. And I believe very much that trust is a deliberate outcome of specific actions and practices that increase the likelihood that the technologies and the innovations that we create, that we use, that we adopt, that it is likely to preserve the trust that we all place in it. And that's an important point today, right? The speed of technology, the way it's being deployed and adopted, is something we have never seen before. You may have seen these statistics, but they're quite staggering. What had previously taken years or even decades for technology to be adopted is happening so much faster today. Even just in the tech sector that we've all been experiencing in recent years. YouTube, as a technology platform for video sharing, reached 100 million users in 4 years. ChatGPT got there in 2 months. That's extraordinary, the speed of adoption. And when systems grow this fast, there's truly no margin for error. So that if something goes wrong, it goes wrong everywhere globally, instantly. So it's more imperative today than ever before that we are proactive about doing things up front that prevent those sorts of downstream failures and crises, because they touch real people and real lives, financial impacts, reputational impacts, and so forth. And so I believe it's imperative for the technologists, the product managers, the leaders of industry to be thoughtful proactively. And for all of us, the adopters, the users, the funders, the decision makers in the technology world, to demand that of ourselves and those who are building and deploying these technologies. I teach about crisis management and MBA programs, and we go through examples of crises that have hit our industries and impacted real lives. I'll give you just a few to whet your appetite, and we might go into some of these examples in more detail in future episodes. But the first one that many think of when we think of a major crisis is the Boeing 737 MAX crisis. Of course, it's a few years old, but it has resurfaced recently. Yeah, unfortunately, a company that has been renowned for engineering reliability with the development and manufacture of commercial airplanes in the United States suffered 2 catastrophic plane crashes that resulted in 346 lives lost. Unfortunately, there was a root cause, a critical flight control system that pilots weren't even informed about, that had a single point of failure and resulted in unprecedented losses. There are multiple contributing factors here, a culture that drove competitive pressures and cut some corners that could have prevented this type of failure. And that's an example that we can all rally behind because of the tremendous impacts on real people. There are many other examples. The data breach for 23andMe. You all know 23andMe as the company that would you swab your cheek, send in your DNA sample, and have your genetic sequence and ancestry sent back to you in short order. But they suffered a massive data breach. Over 7 million people had their genetic information stolen. Now, DNA isn't something you can change like a credit card number or a bank account. This is immutable information about yourself and, frankly, about your family as well. It was a pretty disturbing occurrence for those who trusted a company like 23andMe. And it turned out that the cybersecurity attack in this case was a relatively simple one: credential stuffing through stolen credentials. And as a result, the company actually filed for bankruptcy soon after this major breach, which is another consequence, another downstream business impact of a serious breach of trust, like a data loss like this. And another example is the Taylor Swift Ticketmaster debacle of just a few years back. If you recall, Taylor Swift was preparing for Eras tour with unprecedented demand. Everyone, including my daughter, were lining up to try to get tickets to this event, and Ticketmaster thought they could support the demand. But unfortunately, their system wasn't prepared for the high volume and frequency of the demand for tickets, and 3.5 million fans struggled in waiting in queues because of this system failure. As a result, Congress held hearings, there were lawsuits, and millions of fans missed out. One last example, the dreaded blue screen of death. Some of you may remember July 2024, when CrowdStrike suffered a massive IT outage. There were millions of Windows machines that were surfacing that blue screen of death in airports, in financial markets, in hospitals. As a result, 911 services were offline. Financial markets around the globe were frozen. 8.5 million systems were affected in a single day. This wasn't a cyber attack. It wasn't a natural disaster. It was actually just a faulty software update from a company, CrowdStrike, that was trusted to prevent these types of failures. These systems are woven together in ways that you don't fully understand until something breaks. And these costs are enormous. Financial costs, operational costs, disruption to your business, reputational costs, regulatory consequences, and harm to real people. Now, the reality is these stakes are too high for trust to be considered as an afterthought or something you bolt on after you develop a technology, bring it to market, and then think through the downstream consequences. We need to design trust in from the start to prevent these types of catastrophic failures that often result in broken trust with stakeholders that you depend on. And many businesses don't recover from these types of failures. And so there are many things. There's obviously not a singular action anybody can take to prevent these types of failures, but I'm going to highlight today a few examples of practices, specific practices that you can take to try to prevent these types of downstream failures, outages, and crises. And in the book that I am preparing to publish in 2027, I'm going to be detailing many more examples of specific actions, strategies, and practices that are real. These are not philosophical discussions. These are not ethical concerns. These are actual things you can do. You can implement in your organization, actions that you can take. All right. So the first of the three actions that I'm going to highlight today is something I call pay your customers. And this practice is all about engaging your user community early and often. And I'd argue that too often today, this is done in a relatively inadequate way. Right? Most people say that they know their users, they've built empathy maps, they've thought about who they would like to target, they've maybe done some usability testing, but largely with people maybe who look like the developers or who are easy to access or are fairly fluent in technology. Unfortunately, that's not a very sophisticated set of user insights. And so I will recommend that one of the best practices to try to prevent downstream user harm and impacts that are negatively going to impact your brand, your reputation, your financial viability, and your business are to engage users in a much more active way earlier and more often than ever before. One example of a company that's done this really well is a company named Embrace Global. They sought to try to build a solution to tackle the challenge of premature infants in sub-Saharan Africa and rural India that were dying at alarming rates. Unfortunately, the incubators, the standard incubators that were being used in those regions of the world were unaffordable, and in many of the locations, electricity wasn't reliable. And so this Embrace team was going after solving this problem. Instead of going into a lab and inventing a solution and trying it out in the field, they actually went first to engage with the people struggling with the problem. They actually went overseas, talked to the community, worked together with the healthcare workers, the community members, the mothers, and said, what could we build that could help address this problem? In the end, they co-created with the users a low-cost, portable infant warmer that was usable by anyone, anywhere. And it saved over 1 million babies because the people who understood the problem most helped design the solutions. The reality is our world of potential users of our technologies, our products, our solutions, our apps is far more diverse than the development team reflects, than your community reflects. Over 8 billion people in this world that vary by language, age, gender, ability, and access. And so thinking through who are those potential users and what assumptions have you made about them that you need to challenge? And how can you bring them in early, during prototyping, during research, during testing, not just after the fact, so that their input is treated as a true design requirement, not as a nice to have. That way, the solutions that you build will meet the needs of real users. And there's a business imperative here, because when you do that, you actually can increase your market size, increase adoption, beat your competitors, because your product is better able to meet the needs of a wide range of users. So that first practice, pay your customers. The second practice I think is so critical, I call break it before your users do. Now, everybody does some sort of testing, of course, right? But usually that minimum testing suite is about product functionality. Does it work? That's necessary, but it is absolutely not sufficient to ensure that it will hold up in the real world. Will it handle the variability of conditions? Will it withstand accelerated conditions, high voltage, vibration, long time? And if you don't know the answer to that, then you're experimenting in the field. And so the idea here is to try to break things on purpose so that you can find the failure modes and fix them before your users discover those failures for themselves. Now, the exemplar here is Netflix. They had a catastrophic outage that they suffered one Christmas Eve when their system went down, and that was a critical moment for families to sit down and watch their movies streaming over Netflix. And they vowed to never let that happen again. So what they did is actually created a tool that randomly pulls the plug on its own servers in production. These aren't careless experiments, they're rehearsals. And it's a tool called Chaos Monkey, and an evolving field that's known as chaos engineering. And the top engineering organizations, technology developers use a similar set of practices to ensure that their products, their technologies, their solutions will hold up in the real world. At IBM, before they ever ship a mainframe system, they ensure that it can withstand earthquake scale vibration testing, literally putting the mainframe system into a large high vibration environment. Regeneron, the biotech company that I sit on the board of directors for, pioneered mice with humanized immune systems so they could find out if a medicine works or where it could fail before a single patient enrolls in a clinical trial. The principle of all these is the same. Find the failures before your users do and fix them. Break it before your users do. The third practice is open the black box. And today, many solutions are considered black boxes. You have an input coming in, you have a black box, there's something happens, and then you have an output. That's very true of AI, where you might have a prompt and then you get an output. You don't really know how the algorithm, how the neural network, how the solution is coming up with that outcome. It appears like magic or like there's something opaque that's happening. And the reality is we're often not satisfied with that, right? The reality is we need to understand what's happening to know whether we can trust that output. And so the reality is we need to find ways to open that black box. This concept of transparency, of course, isn't new, right? For food, every ingredient, every calorie, every allergen is clearly spelled out on that nutrition label on the back of your soup cans, and it's standardized. You know what to expect, and you know exactly where to go to get that information. You expect it, and you look for it. You can compare and contrast, and you decide if it's appropriate, if it's going to be healthy, if you want those ingredients, if your child has an allergy, you decide whether you to purchase it or not. That standardization has revolutionized food, but we haven't yet gotten there with technology, and certainly not yet for AI, but we need to. The same concept of this nutrition label is something we can adopt with technology. And there is an evolution that's happening today with model cards and essentially nutrition labels for AI models that helps us understand what the model does, what data it's been trained on, what it's good at, where it could be wrong. And to me, it's that type of solution that's required for products, services, and technologies so that users and those developing on top of those components can make good decisions with the knowledge of what risks they're taking and how they can take most advantage of the solutions that are being provided. We need that same level of transparency across every technology we depend on. So 3 practices to try to build trust in from the start. Pay your customers, break it before your users do, open the black box. These aren't abstract principles. They're specific actions that you can take before your architecture's set, before your product ships, before your users find what you missed. This, I believe, this is so important, and I hope that whether you're a developer or you're someone on a board who's deciding how to support your company, or you're an advisor or an investor, that you'll embrace this concept that there are specific practices that we can employ that increase the likelihood that trust can be maintained, that we can preserve the positive outcomes and reduce the risk, the likelihood, and the impact of the negative consequences when something with technology goes wrong. And we'll circle back for where I started, is this is more and more important today because of the speed of deployment, the speed of adoption, the interconnectedness of technology systems and ecosystems today, that this isn't optional. This is truly imperative in order for technology to be impactful in a positive way and to reduce those negative potential consequences. When you design trust in from the start, you don't just avoid failure. You build solutions that people can believe in and count on. You build technology worth trusting. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you'll tune in to the next episode of this podcast series, Lead with IT.